Have you ever wondered what is really hiding behind the grand portraits of the 17th and 18th centuries? Recall those images: monarchs, philosophers, aristocrats. An entire era, which we are told was the age of enlightenment and gallantry, appears before us wrapped in powdered curls. But there is one glaring oddity that we are used to ignoring. In these paintings, there is practically not a single living person with natural hair. We have been fed a distorted picture of reality our entire lives. Historians, as if reciting from a script, keep repeating the same thing. Supposedly, it was just fashion, a whim of the rich. They try to convince us that people shaved their heads to save themselves from lice and filth. But engage your critical thinking right now. Do you really believe that an aristocracy possessing the resources to build palaces of incredible complexity and create masterpieces of art could come up with nothing better than wearing a stifling, heavy clump of other people's hair or animal wool on their heads? The official version bursts at the seams as soon as we start analyzing facts instead of blindly believing textbooks. Let's break down this fairy tale about parasites. We are told that lice were eating people alive, so they got rid of their own hair and put on wigs. But from the point of view of biology and elementary logic, this is absurd. A wig made of horsehair or human hair, thickly soaked in fat and powder, is the ideal incubator for any parasite. It is warm, moist, and extremely difficult to clean. If the goal were truly hygiene, people would simply walk around with short haircuts or shaved heads, wiping them with alcohol solutions or vinegar, which were available in any household. But no, they piled kilograms of dead organic matter onto themselves. Why? There can be only one answer. They needed to simulate the presence of hair at any cost. The absence of hair was perceived not as a hygienic norm, but as a stigma, a sign of a terrible disease. This is not fashion. This is total camouflage. We are not looking at the whims of the elite, but at an epidemic of the hairless. Think about why this strange fetish sees the entire civilized world simultaneously. From London to St. Petersburg, from Paris to the American colonies. Thousands, tens of thousands of people suddenly lost their natural covering. Documents, memoirs, and medical reports of that time, which historians carefully bypass, describe not voluntary shaving, but hair loss, total alopecia. Aristocrats, the ruling elite, those who were supposed to be the standard of health, turned into bald, sickly creatures. In this light, the wig ceases to be an accessory and becomes a prosthesis. It was a desperate attempt to hide a physical deformity that suddenly struck an entire generation. Remember the reforms of Peter the Great. We are told that he chopped off the beards of the boyars to instill European culture. But what if everything was exactly the opposite? What if the Tsar, or the person who took his place, knew the terrible truth? Beards simply stopped growing. A huge layer of the population began to undergo irreversible changes in their bodies. The beard tax was a brilliant manipulation, a way to legalize beardlessness. If hair doesn't grow on your face, you pay a fine, or acknowledge yourself as a European. Thus, a physical defect caused by external influence was turned into an elite trait. Those who retained the ability to grow hair were declared backward barbarians, and those who lost it were declared progressive aristocrats. This is a classic substitution of concepts used by social engineers for centuries. But hair is only the tip of the iceberg. If the loss of vegetation was so massive and sudden, it means there was a global physical cause. And if we look closely at the faces of that era, hidden under layers of makeup, and analyze the methods by which these people were treated, a picture opens up before us that makes the blood run cold. We are approaching facts indicating that fashion was merely a screen for something much more sinister. If hair was only the first loss that the elite tried to hide under wigs, then a further study of the appearance of people of that era reveals the scale of a real biological tragedy. Look at the faces staring at us from ceremonial portraits, not as works of art, but as medical evidence. A huge amount of white lead, lead powder, cinnabar, and arsenic, men and women applied literally kilograms of toxic plaster to themselves. Official history assures us that this was the canon of beauty, that deathly pallor was considered a sign of high birth. But let's be honest, healthy skin does not need to be smeared with a layer of toxic metal a finger thick. This was not aesthetics. It was forced camouflage. What exactly were they hiding so diligently under a layer of lead, even knowing that this cosmetic was slowly poisoning their bodies? The answer lies in symptoms that are impossible to ignore. Ulcers, unhealing abscesses, pigment spots of strange origin, and traces surprisingly similar to radiation burns. The skin of 18th century aristocrats was affected by something that categorically could not be shown to society. The fear of demonstrating the true state of their faces was stronger than the fear of a slow fading from heavy metal poisoning. We are facing a fact of mass damage to a biological species, where fashion served only as a screen for a global pathology. Another fragment of this frightening puzzle is the state of teeth. Most rulers and nobles of that time had a practically completely absent set of teeth by the age of 30 or 40. We are often given the example of the first US president, George Washington, whose mouth was filled with complex dentures. Historians explain this by excessive sugar consumption. But sugar was an expensive pleasure in those days, and even if available, it is not capable of causing total jaw necrosis in an entire social class simultaneously. Rotting gums and dissolving bone tissue are classic signs of heavy metal poisoning or exposure to radiation, which tends to accumulate in the bones, causing so-called radium necrosis. That is why the fans, with which ladies and gentlemen so coquettishly fanned themselves, were used not only for flirting, but also to waft away the fetid breath of decay coming from their interlocutor's mouth. Pay attention also to the strange evolution of clothing. High stand-up collars, voluminous jabots, and neckerchiefs covering a person up to the very chin. The thyroid gland is the first organ to react to an aggressive radiation background or toxic pollution. An epidemic of throat diseases, the appearance of goiters, and scars from forced surgeries compelled tailors to create styles that completely concealed the neck. Gloves, which were not removed even indoors, hid deformed nails and ulcers on the hands. The aristocracy was literally rotting alive, and their wardrobe was designed to hide this process of decay. Here we come to a rethinking of the medicine of that time, which is generally considered barbaric. If you open old pharmacopoeias, horror will seize you. The main medicine was mercury, and the main procedure was bloodletting. We are told that doctors were ignorant, but this is a lie. The same minds that designed the most complex navigation systems and calculated the orbits of planets perfectly understood the toxicity of mercury. The use of this heavy metal was a desperate attempt at chemotherapy. In certain protocols, albeit cruel ones, mercury could be used as a means to displace other, more dangerous isotopes or toxins from the body. They drank mercury and breathed its vapors not out of stupidity, but in an attempt to stop the rapid destruction of their bodies. The same applies to bloodletting. Historians laugh at the fact that doctors drained liters of blood for any reason. But in conditions of critical environmental poisoning, this looks like the only logical solution. If the lymphatic system is overloaded with decay products, and the blood is saturated with toxins, then its mechanical removal is a primitive but effective dialysis. They drained contaminated fluid in the hope that the body would produce new, clean blood. It was not a superstitious practice, but the harsh logic of survival in a biological catastrophe. The bodies of the elite were collapsing before their eyes, and all their actions were aimed at prolonging life at any cost. But here arises the most terrible question. Hair loss, skin lesions, bone destruction, organ failure, these are all symptoms. Symptoms of what? Why did these diseases seize everyone simultaneously on different continents? The probability that such a specific fashion for diseases arose by chance is 0. We are coming very close to understanding that the habitat changed globally. Aristocrats, who had access to the best food and protection, suffered first precisely because they were at the epicenter of events. What exactly were these people breathing? What happened in the Earth's atmosphere shortly before the beginning of the so-called Age of Gallantry, turning the planet into a poisoned trap? If we accept as a fact that the biological organisms of the ruling elite were rapidly deteriorating, rotting, and losing vitality, then we are obliged to take the next logical step. Admit that the environment had become aggressive. The human body is a perfect self-regulating system, and for it to start failing on such a scale in thousands of people simultaneously, the external impact must be total. We are approaching a theory that is feared in departments of classical history, the theory that the Earth's atmosphere during that period was poisoned. There is a hypothesis that hair, being a kind of biological antenna and indicator of the body's state, took the first hit. It is the first to react to changes in the chemical composition of the air and radiation background. In conditions of global pollution of the ether, the medium that every living thing breathed, hair follicles simply died off, unable to withstand the toxic load. It was a mass failure of the endocrine system, which tried to save vital organs by shedding ballast in the form of hair cover. It is at this moment that we encounter another glaring contradiction that historians prefer not to notice, writing everything off as the whims of architects. We are talking about an architectural mismatch that screams that the habitat changed instantly and catastrophically. Look at the palaces of St. Petersburg, Paris, or Vienna. These are buildings with giant single-pane windows, huge halls, and soaring ceilings reaching 5 or 6 meters. And all this, according to official chronology, was built at the height of the so-called Little Ice Age. We are told that the climate was severe, the Thames and the Bosphorus froze over, birds dropped dead in mid-flight, and rivers froze to the very bottom. Think about this absurdity. Aristocrats suffering from diseases and cold supposedly built stone bags that were physically impossible to heat. Bald, weakened people in silk stockings and powdered wigs would simply have frozen to death in these grand halls during the very first winter. The fireplaces we see in palaces today often look like decorative inserts or primitive hearths tacked on much later. They are disproportionately small for heating such colossal volumes of air. Their thermal efficiency is negligible for halls hundreds of square meters in area. This can only mean one thing. The buildings were designed and built for a completely different climate. Mild, warm, subtropical. Or they were calculated for other heating technologies that did not require burning wood. Technologies that were lost. The conclusion suggests itself, harsh and uncompromising. The people of the Whig era did not build these cities. They found them. The era we call the time of great construction was actually the era of great settlement. The hairless aristocrats were not brilliant architects, but squatters, refugees on their own planet. They occupied empty, perhaps partially destroyed cities of a highly developed preceding civilization. They inserted their primitive wooden frames into giant openings designed for completely different glazing standards, or even for the absence thereof. They hung their paintings over frescoes whose meaning they no longer understood, and called it the founding of cities, although in reality it was an inventory of ruins. These people were forced to hide their bald heads under wigs, and their freezing bodies under numerous layers of clothing and fur coats, which they wore even indoors. They populated the ruins, trying to keep warm by primitive hearths in the houses of giants. They were looters who appropriated the grandeur of the past to which they had no relation. That is why in old paintings, ruin artists depicted majestic ruins overgrown with trees with photographic precision right in the middle of supposedly thriving capitals. It was not a fantasy, it was a documentation of the reality of that time. But the evidence of this global catastrophe is found not only in the architecture of the upper floors or on old canvases. The most irrefutable facts are hidden right under your feet. You walk past them every day, your gaze slides over them, but your brain, programmed by the school curriculum, refuses to perceive the anomaly. We are talking about what is buried underground and the secret kept by the basements of historical buildings. Walk through the historic center of any old city, be it Moscow, Prague, Rome, or London, and pay attention to a detail that our brain is used to filtering out as insignificant background noise. You will see the same impossible picture: ground floor windows that go deep underground, turning into basement loopholes. We are told that this is the so-called cultural layer. Official science tries to convince us that over 200 or 300 years, humanity threw so much garbage, manure, and dirt under its feet that the surface level rose by 3 or even 4 meters. We are asked to believe that the inhabitants of European capitals were so lazy and unclean that they did not remove waste, but simply trampled it down, building new roads year after year right on top of the first floors of their dwellings. Think about the monstrous absurdity of this statement. Do you really believe that aristocrats in snow-white stockings, powdered wigs, and expensive camisoles, who cared so fanatically about their status and appearance, walked knee-deep in filth for decades? Did the owners of luxurious mansions really allow dirt to block their grand entrances and windows, turning full-fledged residential floors into dark basements? This is a lie calculated for a complete lack of critical thinking. Dirt does not grow by itself like grass, and it does not accumulate in an even layer throughout the city. No cultural layer of such volume exists. Before us are irrefutable traces of a global catastrophe, that very flood or giant mudslide of a planetary scale that covered civilization with a dense blanket of clay and silt. And here we return to our hairless aristocrats, and the connection between buried floors and wigs becomes frighteningly direct. The catastrophe that buried the first floors of buildings brought with it not just soil. This alluvial clay was saturated with heavy chemical elements or radioactive isotopes. The soil was literally glowing with radiation. Those who survived or came to these territories immediately after the cataclysm found themselves at the epicenter of radiation or chemical contamination. Evaporation from this moist, toxic clay, covering meters of urban space, hit the most vulnerable systems: the endocrine system and genetics. People lived literally on the radioactive landfill of history. That is why the nobility tried to settle as high as possible. Remember the classic layout of old buildings? The ground floor was always given to servants, the kitchen, or for household needs, while the owners occupied the so-called bel étage, the second or third level. This was not a whim, but a matter of survival. The closer to the ground, the closer to this cultural layer, the stronger the destructive impact. But even this did not save them. The atmosphere was poisoned everywhere, and the epidemic of baldness covered everyone, becoming a marker of the degeneration of an entire class. Now, let's compare the physical condition of these people with the technological achievements attributed to them. Official history claims that this generation, treating themselves with mercury, suffering from hair and tooth loss, and having no basic sewage system, allegedly built grandiose granite embankments and star fortresses all over the planet. Have you seen the geometry of these forts? These are ideal mathematical figures, calibrated to the centimeter, faced with stone weighing tons, with polygonal masonry where you can't even insert a knife blade between the blocks. We are told that soldiers did this with shovels and wheelbarrows. This is a technological absurdity. The volume of earth and stonework in the construction of just one such star exceeds the physical capabilities of any army of that time, even if they worked around the clock without food or sleep. And there are thousands of such stars, from Europe to Japan, from America to Australia. Who built them? Bald, sick people dying at 40 from lead and arsenic poisoning? No, they didn't build them. They dug them out. The era we call the peak of architecture was actually the era of the Great Excavation. They merely cleared what remained of the giants of the past, plastered over ancient brick, and passed it off as their creations. But if the cities were buried, and the previous population, possessing high technologies, perished or mutated into those same sick aristocrats, then the most terrible and uncomfortable question arises. Who then populated these excavated ruins? Where did the millions of people come from who filled the cities in the 19th century, if the birth rate among the sick elite should have dropped to zero, and the peasantry could not provide such an explosive increase in post-apocalyptic conditions? Let's look the truth in the eye and turn to dry, unemotional statistics, which destroy the official picture of the world faster than any dynamite. If you open the demographic graphs of the 19th century, you will encounter a phenomenon that defies any traditional biological explanation. The population growth curve does not just go up smoothly, it takes off vertically, demonstrating exponential growth. We are tried to be convinced that this is the result of a sudden improvement in medicine and the agrarian revolution, but we have just analyzed the real state of affairs. Medicine of that time was a dangerous mixture of mercury and bloodletting, and cities were cluttered with clay and sewage. In conditions of total unsanitary conditions, rampant epidemics of cholera and typhus, with a complete lack of antibiotics and normal hygiene, the Earth's population suddenly begins to double and triple in record time. This is mathematically and biologically impossible. Women physically could not carry and preserve the lives of such a quantity of offspring in those monstrous conditions. The only logical explanation for this phenomenon is a massive injection of adult or teenage population from outside, or the artificial cultivation of humans on an industrial scale. And here, the so-called foundling homes enter the historical stage. These giant structures appear in Moscow, St. Petersburg, London, and Paris almost synchronously. Look at the plans of the Moscow Foundling Home. This is not a modest shelter for orphans. It is a real factory, a huge palace complex surpassing many royal residences in scale. The length of its facade is hundreds of meters, and the internal infrastructure resembles an autonomous city. Why would the state spend millions of gold rubles and thousands of tons of scarce brick on maintaining illegitimate children, whom the patriarchal society of that time, in theory, should have despised and rejected? Official statistics state that millions of babies pass through these homes. Where did such a colossal number of abandoned children come from, in a deeply religious society where extramarital affairs were considered a grave sin? We are told, poverty. But even in extreme need, mothers do not hand over their children to state institutions for certain death in such quantities. This contradicts the basic instinct of survival of the species. There is a frightening hypothesis that these foundling homes were not shelters of mercy at all, but distribution centers or even incubators. In the archives, there are strange mentions that babies were brought in by convoys, by the thousands, without documents, without names or surnames. They were simply numbered, like products on a conveyor belt. Where did they come from? There is a version that these were children taken from the population of captured territories, from those who remembered the old world. But there is also a more radical theory: the use of cloning technologies or artificial cultivation that remained from the past civilization, and were launched by the new masters of life to quickly restore the workforce. They needed not citizens, but slaves. They needed hands to dig out buried cities, lay railways, and work in factories. The ideal slave is one who does not remember his parents, does not know his history, and has no ancestral attachment. Remember the strange fashion for cabbage postcards of that time. Seemingly an innocent joke, children are found in cabbage. But why are there thousands of these postcards? Why do they depict endless fields literally strewn with babies being harvested like a crop? In the symbolism of secret societies, nothing happens just because. Perhaps this is a direct allusion to bioengineering technologies. Cabbage is a metaphor for layering, an artificial structure. We see a hint that the population was restored in an unnatural way. It was a global repopulation operation. This also explains the appearance of a huge number of new noble families that emerged from nowhere. Many surnames were simply invented and distributed to the most loyal graduates of these incubators, who became overseers of the rest of the mass. A new social hierarchy was being created. The Foundling homes became the forge of a new humanity, obedient, standardized, and rootless. This was a generation of Ivans who did not remember their kinship. They were raised in barracks conditions, given minimal skills, and taught a primitive language. That is why we know nothing about the catastrophe. The chain of oral information transmission was forcibly broken. Between us and our real ancestors stands a wall of this incubator generation, whose memory began with a cot in a foundling home and a warden's whistle. They were a blank slate. And on this slate, the new elites, those same bald people in wigs, had to write the history that was profitable for them, to explain to these millions of orphans who they were and in what world they lived. Thus was committed the greatest substitution of concepts in history. The generation gap, artificially created with the help of the Foundling home system, became the ideal foundation for writing a new history. Millions of incubator children, deprived of ancestral memory and connection with their forefathers, represented a blank slate on which the surviving elite could inscribe any postulates. It was at this moment that the greatest sabotage was committed not only in chronicles, but also in fundamental science. Those who came to power in the 19th century faced the need to manage the remnants of humanity and an army of newly created workers on the ruins of a world whose technologies they themselves did not fully understand or intentionally wanted to hide. They needed to simplify reality to the level of understanding of a worker at a machine, to erase any memories that energy was once free and accessible to everyone. Recall how ether, the zero element, Newtonium, mysteriously disappeared from the original periodic table of Mendeleev. This is not just a chemical term, it is a concept of a world medium permeating all space and allowing energy to be obtained literally from the air. Old cathedrals, with their spires, domes, and metal frames, as well as star fortresses, were initially not religious or fortification structures in our current understanding. These were stations for collecting, concentrating, and transmitting atmospheric electricity. Gilded domes, complex geometric shapes, an abundance of metal. All these are elements of a single global energy grid that worked on principles that today would be called science fiction. After the catastrophe and the seizure of control, this technology was declared forbidden. The new masters of the world literally cut the wires. They dismantled resonators, removed metal connections where possible, and declared these high-tech complexes temples for worshipping gods whom they themselves approved in new religious canons. Instead of pure ether energy, humanity was imposed with a hydrocarbon economy: coal, oil, gas. The reason is simple and cynical. What needs to be extracted from the earth, transported, and burned can be controlled, metered, and sold. Ether cannot be controlled. It is omnipresent. The ban on ether technologies became an act of enslaving humanity through the consumption meter. In this scheme, the aristocracy and Wigs played the role not so much of supreme rulers as of overseers. a kind of colony administration. They were liquidators of the consequences of the catastrophe, middle managers who received the right to live in surviving palaces and hold titles in exchange for loyalty and absolute silence. Their diseases, mutations, and the need to hide physical defects under layers of powder and wigs were the price for proximity to the epicenter of events, for contact with artifacts of the past that continued to emit a dangerous background. The wig became not just a camouflage, but a uniform, a badge of distinction for a caste initiated into the secret, separating them from the gray mass of bio-robots raised in shelters. We were invented a history of ancient Rome and Greece. The chronology was shifted thousands of years back to artificially lengthen the timeline and break the connection of times. We were told that we descended from primitive ancestors so that we would never guess that we are actually degraded descendants of titans, or, even more tragically, the result of genetic engineering on their bones. We live in a state of a cargo cult. We use buildings whose true purpose we do not understand. We admire columns, porticos, and arches, considering them elements of decor, although initially they were functional nodes of lost physics. We walk along streets under which lie real first floors, and we think that this is how it should be. However, any system built on lies, sooner or later, fails. The effect of mass hypnosis begins to weaken. Genetic memory, which cannot be erased permanently, wakes up. People begin to notice inconsistencies, ask uncomfortable questions, and see what was previously hidden by a veil of habit. Why did stone processing technologies degrade from ideal polygonal masonry to crooked brick? Why do ancient maps depict cities where today there are deserts? Our entire official history is a dilapidated screen stretched over a rotten frame. The Great Reset has already happened, and we are at the end of another cycle. The epidemic of the hairless was merely a marker of the beginning of a new era. The era of the artificial man, torn from nature and the cosmos. But now that you know where to look, you can no longer unsee the truth. Simply go out into the street of your city. Look at the granite embankments that cannot be processed with a chisel. Stare into the dead eyes of people in old portraits. And ask yourself, is this really the world written about in textbooks? Or is it a decoration hiding the truth about the greatest crime against humanity? The masquerade continues, but now you see the strings holding the puppets. Are you ready to look even deeper and find out exactly what was destroyed to build this world of illusions?